In the rugged mountains of 1880s Colorado, there lived a man who hadn't spoken a word to another soul in over 7 years. Ezra Stone was feared by the townsfolk of Cedar Ridge and pitied by those brave enough to glimpse him from afar. His massive frame and wild beard made him look more beast than man as he wandered the wilderness alone. The children whispered stories about the silent giant who lived in a cabin high up in the peaks, while their parents warned them to stay away from the mountain trails where he might appear like a dark shadow among the pines. Then came the day when a determined schoolteacher arrived in town, carrying nothing but a worn carpetbag and an unshakable belief that every soul deserved kindness. What could possibly make a man who had forgotten how to speak suddenly burst into laughter? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The stagecoach lurched to a stop outside Murphy's saloon, sending a cloud of dust swirling through the main street of Cedar Ridge. Clara Bennett stepped down carefully, her worn leather boots finding purchase on the rough wooden planks that served as a sidewalk. She clutched her carpet bag tighter, feeling the weight of her teaching certificate pressed between the layers of her few belongings. The town was smaller than she had imagined, little more than a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a single dirt road that wound its way up into the mountains. The saloon dominated one side of the street, its painted sign faded by years of harsh mountain weather. Across from it stood the general store, a blacksmith shop, and what appeared to be the sheriff's office, identified by a crooked wooden sign hanging from chains. Clara had traveled 3 days from Denver to reach this remote settlement, following a newspaper advertisement seeking a schoolteacher willing to work in the frontier territories. The pay was modest, but the letter from the town council had emphasized their desperate need for someone educated and patient enough to handle the children of miners, ranchers, and shopkeepers who had carved out lives in these unforgiving mountains. Mrs. Murphy emerged from the saloon, wiping her hands on a stained apron. She was a sturdy woman with graying hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to take the measure of everything around her. "You must be the new teacher," she said, her voice carrying the slight accent of someone who had crossed an ocean to find opportunity in America. "Miss Clara Bennett," Clara replied, extending her hand with a warm smile. "I'm grateful for your offer of lodging until I can find permanent arrangements." Mrs. Murphy's expression softened slightly as she shook Clara's hand. "You're younger than I expected, and prettier too. Are you certain you understand what you're getting yourself into, dear? This isn't some fancy finishing school back east." Before Clara could respond, a tall man with a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest approached them. Sheriff Davies had the weathered look of someone who had spent years dealing with the challenges of maintaining law and order in a place where civilization felt tenuous at best. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge, Miss Bennett," he said, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. "I hope Miss Fear has warned you about what you're facing. These mountain children can be a handful, and some of their parents aren't much better." Clara straightened her shoulders, drawing on the determination that had carried her through teacher training and across half the country. "I believe children respond to patience and kindness, Sheriff Davies. I'm here because I want to make a difference." The sheriff and Mrs. Murphy exchanged a meaningful glance that Clara didn't quite understand. Mrs. Murphy cleared her throat. "There are things you should know about this place, dear. Dangers you might not expect." "Dangers?" Sheriff Davies shifted uncomfortably. "There's a man lives up in the mountains, been there for years, maybe 7 or 8 now, never comes to town, never speaks to anyone. Some folks call him the Mountain Man. Others just call him trouble, waiting to happen. He's enormous," Mrs. Murphy added, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper. "Wild hair down to his shoulders, beard like a grizzly bear. Children have nightmares about him." Clara frowned. "Has he hurt anyone?" "Well, no," the sheriff admitted, "but he's not natural. The way he lives up there all alone, never speaking, never joining civilized society. Some say he's touched in the head, maybe dangerous. Others think he's hiding from something, maybe the law. I've heard him called Ezra Stone," Mrs. Murphy said. Though I couldn't tell you if that's his real name or just something folks made up. Point is, if you're planning to explore these mountains, you need to be careful. Stay on the main trails. Don't go wandering off alone. Clara absorbed this information thoughtfully. She had encountered fear and suspicion before, usually directed at people who were different or misunderstood. Perhaps this man simply prefers solitude. Not everyone is suited for town life. The sheriff shook his head. Miss Bennet, I admire your charitable nature, but you don't understand. This isn't about preferring solitude. This is about a man who's completely cut himself off from human contact. That's not natural, and it's not safe. As if summoned by their conversation, a small group of children appeared around the corner of the general store, drawn by curiosity about the newcomer. They ranged in age from perhaps 6 to 14. Their clothes practical but clean, their faces bright with intelligence despite the harsh environment they called home. "Is that her?" whispered a girl with braided pigtails. "Is that our new teacher?" Clara smiled and knelt down to be at eye level with the smallest child, a boy who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. "Hello there. What's your name?" "Tommy," the boy said shyly. "Are you really going to teach us reading and writing and arithmetic?" "I certainly am, Tommy, and I think we're going to have wonderful adventures learning together." As Clara spoke with the children, she noticed how they seemed to relax in her presence, their initial wariness giving way to cautious excitement. These were good children, she realized, who had simply been waiting for someone to believe in their potential. 7 years earlier, the Copper Creek mine had been the heart of Cedar Ridge's economy. The mountain had yielded its treasures generously, filling the pockets of investors in Denver, while providing steady work for men willing to risk their lives in the dark tunnels that honeycombed the earth. Ezra Stone had been 28 then, strong as an ox and blessed with an intuitive understanding of rock formations that made him invaluable to the mining operation. He could read the mountain's moods, sensing when a section of tunnel grew unstable or when a new vein of ore lay hidden just beyond the current excavation. But more than his professional skills, Ezra was known for his devotion to his younger brother David. David Stone was everything Ezra was not. Bright and talkative where Ezra was steady and quiet, quick with a joke where Ezra preferred thoughtful silence. At 19, David possessed an infectious optimism that made him popular with the other miners despite his relative inexperience. He looked up to his older brother with undisguised admiration, following Ezra's lead in everything from mining techniques to the way he treated the other workers with quiet respect. The brothers had come to Colorado from Pennsylvania after their parents died in a typhoid outbreak, seeking opportunity in the expanding frontier. They shared a small cabin near the mine entrance, their evenings filled with David's chatter about his plans for the future, and Ezra's patient listening. David dreamed of saving enough money to buy land, maybe starting a ranch or a business in one of the growing towns along the railroad. Ezra's dreams were simpler, but no less heartfelt. He wanted to see his brother succeed and be happy. On that October morning when everything changed, the mine had been experiencing unusual pressure shifts deep in the newest tunnel. Ezra had mentioned his concerns to the foreman, but production quotas demanded that work continued despite the warning signs only an experienced miner could detect. The mountain was restless, creaking and settling in ways that made Ezra's skin crawl with foreboding. David had been assigned to work the new section, placing support timbers while other men blasted deeper into the rock face. Ezra should have been working alongside him, but a last-minute change in assignments had sent him to inspect a collapse in the older section of the mine. He had protested, wanting to keep his brother close where he could watch over him, but the foreman had insisted. The explosion came without warning, a deep rumbling that shook the entire mountain and sent clouds of dust billowing from the mine entrance. Ezra had been nearly a quarter-mile away when the support timbers failed, but he felt the concussion through the soles of his feet and knew immediately that something catastrophic had occurred. He ran through the tunnels, his lantern casting wild shadows on the rough walls as he navigated collapsed passages and debris. Other miners were fleeing toward the surface, their faces pale with terror. But Ezra pushed deeper into the mountain, calling his brother's name into the choking darkness. When he found David, The young man was pinned beneath a massive timber, conscious but badly injured. Blood seeped from a head wound, and his legs were trapped at an angle that told Ezra they were broken. The tunnel around them groaned ominously, more debris falling with each passing moment. "Ezra," David whispered, his voice barely audible above the mountain's protests. "I can't feel my legs." Ezra worked frantically to free his brother, using his bare hands to dig away rocks and trying to liver the timber with his mining pick. The blood-stained tool became slippery in his hands, and precious minutes passed as he struggled against the weight of the mountain itself. David remained conscious, his eyes fixed on his brother's face with complete trust. "You're going to be fine," Ezra said, his voice steady despite the panic clawing at his chest. "I'm going to get you out of here." But even as he spoke, Ezra could see that the tunnel was failing around them. More support beams cracked under the shifting weight of rock and earth. Other miners had tried to reach them, but were driven back by falling debris. The rescue would take hours they didn't have. David seemed to understand before Ezra did. "Brother," he said softly, "you need to go. I'm not leaving you. The whole thing's coming down. You can't save me, but you can save yourself." The mountain shuddered again, and a new section of ceiling collapsed just feet from where they lay. Ezra made one final desperate attempt to move the timber, throwing all his strength against the immovable weight. Something in his back gave way with a sharp crack, but the beam didn't budge. David's hand found Ezra's arm. "Promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll live. Really live. Not just survive. Promise me you'll find something good in this world." Those were the last words David Stone ever spoke. The final collapse came like thunder, and when the rescue crews finally reached them 12 hours later, they found Ezra unconscious, his body shielding his brother's lifeless form from the crushing weight of stone. Clara's first morning as Cedar Ridge's schoolteacher began before dawn, with the sound of her own footsteps echoing through the empty schoolhouse. The building was simple but sturdy, constructed of pine logs chinked with mud and moss. Sunlight filtered through 4 small windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air like tiny spirits welcoming her arrival. She had spent the previous evening arranging the space to her liking, moving the rough-hewn desks into a semicircle that would encourage discussion rather than rigid recitation. On the teacher's desk, she placed a small pressed flower she had picked during her walk from Miss Murphy's boarding house, a delicate purple columbine that seemed to embody her hope of bringing beauty to this harsh frontier environment. The children began arriving as the sun crested the eastern peaks, their voices carrying across the crisp morning air. Tommy, the shy boy she had met the day before, was among the first, accompanied by his older sister Sarah, who possessed the serious demeanor of someone forced to grow up too quickly. Behind them came the Miller twins, identical boys with freckled faces and mischievous grins, followed by a handful of other children, ranging in age from 6 to 14. "Good morning, everyone," Clara said warmly as they filed through the door. "Please take any seat you'd like. Today we're going to get to know each other and discover what wonderful things we can learn together." The morning passed pleasantly, with Clara assessing each child's abilities and interests. She was pleased to discover that several of the older students could read quite well, having been taught by their parents or a previous teacher who had stayed only briefly. The younger ones showed eager curiosity, their hands shooting up whenever she asked questions about letters or numbers. During the noon break, Clara watched the children scatter to their various lunch spots, some heading home to nearby cabins, while others unpacked modest meals from cloth-wrapped bundles. The freedom of the moment called to her, and she decided to explore the mountain trails that began just beyond the edge of town. The path she chose wound gently upward through stands of aspen and pine, their leaves whispering secrets in the mountain breeze. Clara had always found solace in nature, and after the intensity of her first morning with the children, the quiet forest felt like a blessing. She picked wildflowers as she walked, adding to the small bouquet she planned to press between the pages of her journal. The trail led to a small clearing where a stream tumbled down from the higher elevations, creating a natural pool before continuing its journey toward the valley below. Clara knelt beside the water, cupping her hands to drink from the clear, cold stream. The silence was complete except for the gentle murmur of flowing water and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. It was then that she saw him. At first, Clara thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. Across the stream, perhaps 50 yards away, a massive figure emerged from the tree line, like something from the old fairy tales her grandmother used to tell. The man was enormous, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. His hair hung past his shoulders in dark waves, and his beard reached nearly to his chest, both streaked with premature gray that spoke of hard living and harsh weather. But it was his clothes that struck Clara most forcefully. Unlike the wild animal skin garments she might have expected, he wore a simple wool shirt and sturdy pants that, while worn and patched, were clean and well-maintained. His boots were hand-crafted leather, and around his waist hung a leather pouch and what appeared to be a carefully maintained hunting knife. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Clara remained kneeling by the stream, her hand frozen halfway to her mouth, with the cool water still dripping between her fingers. The man stood perfectly still, like a deer caught in an unexpected clearing, his dark eyes wide with what appeared to be genuine shock at finding another human being in his wilderness sanctuary. Clara's first instinct was fear, the natural response to encountering something so far outside her normal experience. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something that surprised her. The man was more afraid of her than she was of him. His entire posture spoke of someone ready to flee at the slightest provocation, and she realized that this chance meeting was probably more disturbing to him than it was to her. Slowly, carefully, Clara rose to her feet. She had always believed that kindness was the proper response to fear, whether in a frightened child or a wild animal. "Hello?" she said softly, her voice carrying clearly across the small distance that separated them. The effect of her words was immediate and dramatic. The man's eyes went even wider, and he took several quick steps backward, his movements surprisingly graceful for someone of his size. For a moment, Clara thought he might speak, might respond to her greeting with words of his own, but instead he turned and melted back into the forest, as silently as he had appeared, leaving Clara alone beside the stream, with only the memory of those startled, deeply sad eyes. She remained by the water for several more minutes, processing what had just occurred. This, she realized, must be the mountain man the townspeople had warned her about. Ezra Stone, the mysterious hermit who had supposedly lived in complete isolation for 7 years. But the man she had just encountered didn't match their descriptions of a dangerous wild creature. He had seemed more like a lost soul, someone who had forgotten how to be around other people, but retained enough humanity to maintain his appearance, and, she suspected, his essential decency. As Clara made her way back down the mountain trail, she found herself thinking not about the warnings she had received, but about the profound loneliness she had glimpsed in those dark eyes. The idea came to Clara during her second week in Cedar Ridge, as she watched young Tommy struggle with his letters at the worn wooden desk. The boy's frustration reminded her of her own childhood difficulties with arithmetic, and how her mother's patient encouragement had made all the difference. Kindness, Clara had learned, was often more powerful than force, especially when dealing with those who had been hurt or forgotten. That afternoon, she stopped by Mrs. Murphy's kitchen and asked permission to bake extra bread. The older woman raised an eyebrow but agreed, perhaps sensing that Clara's request stemmed from something more significant than simple hunger. "Planning to feed the whole town, are you?" Mrs. Murphy asked, watching Clara measure flour with careful precision. "Something like that," Clara replied, with a smile that didn't quite explain her intentions. The next morning, Clara rose even earlier than usual and packed a small cloth bundle containing a warm loaf of bread, still fragrant from the oven, along with a jar of Mrs. Murphy's honey and a brief note written in her careful penmanship, "For whoever might be hungry, a gift from a friend." She retraced her steps along the mountain trail to the clearing where she had encountered the mysterious man 3 days earlier. The stream gurgled its familiar melody, and morning sunlight dappled the forest floor through the canopy of leaves above. Clara placed her bundle on a flat stone near the water's edge, positioning it where it would be easily visible but protected from any passing wildlife. As she walked back towards town, Clara felt a strange mixture of nervousness and anticipation. She had no way of knowing whether her gift would be discovered, appreciated, or simply ignored. But something deep in her teacher's heart told her that everyone deserved to know they mattered to someone, even if that someone was a stranger. For 3 days, Clara's offerings disappeared without a trace. She varied her gifts slightly, sometimes including fresh vegetables from the school garden, other times adding wildflowers or a small jar of preserves. Each morning brought the same routine: place the bundle, return to town, wonder throughout the day whether her gesture had been received with gratitude or suspicion. On the 4th day, Clara found something unexpected waiting for her. Beside the stream, placed carefully on the same flat stone where she had been leaving her gifts, sat a small wooden cup. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, carved from what appeared to be a single piece of pine and polished to a smooth finish that spoke of countless hours of patient work. The proportions were perfect, the grain of the wood highlighted by subtle tool marks that revealed the maker's skill and attention to detail. Clara picked up the cup with trembling hands, turning it over to examine the intricate patterns carved around its base. Tiny leaves and flowers wound in an endless spiral, each detail so precise it seemed the wooden foliage might rustle in an unfelt breeze. This was not the work of someone crude or uncivilized. This was art, created by hands that understood beauty and possessed the skill to bring it into existence. She filled the cup with clear stream water and drank from it, the cool liquid somehow tasting sweeter than it ever had before. This simple wooden vessel represented something profound: acknowledgement, gratitude, and perhaps the beginning of communication between two people who had never spoken. From that day forward, Clara's morning ritual expanded. Along with her usual offerings of food and flowers, she began leaving small notes, sharing bits of her daily life and thoughts. She wrote about her students' progress, about the changing weather, about books she was reading by lamplight in her small room above the saloon. Her messages were always friendly but never demanding, offering connection without insisting upon it. The responses, when they came, were equally careful and considerate. Never words, but always meaningful objects that spoke of careful observation and thoughtful craftsmanship. A perfectly round stone, polished smooth by countless hours of patient rubbing. A bundle of medicinal herbs, dried and arranged with obvious knowledge of their healing properties. Small wooden carvings of forest animals, each one capturing some essential characteristic of its living counterpart. Clara began to understand that these gifts represented a form of conversation, a way for someone who had forgotten how to use words to express thoughts and feelings that might otherwise remain locked away. Each carved figure, each carefully selected stone, carried meaning that went beyond its simple appearance. The most surprising gift appeared on a Friday morning in late September, as the aspen leaves were beginning their spectacular transformation from green to gold. Clara approached her usual spot by the stream and found a crude but unmistakable wooden carving of a schoolhouse, complete with tiny windows and a miniature bell tower. The details were rough compared to the maker's other work, but the meaning was clear. He had been watching, listening, learning about her life and work. Clara clutched the wooden schoolhouse to her chest, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Somewhere in these mountains lived a man who understood loneliness and isolation, someone who had been touched by her simple gestures of kindness. Through their wordless exchange of gifts, they had begun to build something that neither had dared hope for: the fragile beginning of human connection. That afternoon, as Clara taught her students about the changing seasons and the way plants prepared for winter's challenges, she found herself thinking about patience and persistence. Some of life's most important lessons, she realized, couldn't be rushed or forced. They had to grow naturally, like the trust that was slowly developing between her and the silent man in the mountain. When she returned to the stream the following morning, Clara left her usual bundle of food along with a new addition, a small piece of paper with a simple message written in her careful script. "Thank you for the beautiful schoolhouse. Your gifts bring joy to my day." Sheriff Davies found Clara grading papers by lamplight in the schoolhouse one evening in early October, her pen moving carefully across the children's arithmetic exercises. The autumn air had grown crisp enough to require a small fire in the pot-bellied stove that heated the single room, and Clara had wrapped herself in a woolen shawl as she worked. "Miss Bennet," the sheriff said, removing his hat as he entered. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I wanted to speak with you about something that's been troubling me." Clara looked up from Tommy's carefully formed numbers, noting the serious expression on the lawman's weathered face. "Of course, Sheriff. Please have a seat." Davies pulled up one of the student chairs, which looked comically small beneath his tall frame. He fidgeted with his hat brim for a moment before speaking. "Some of the parents have mentioned that you've been taking regular walks up into the mountains alone." "I enjoy the fresh air and exercise," Clara said carefully. "The mountain trails are quite beautiful this time of year." "They are indeed," Davies agreed. "But Miss Bennet, I've been sheriff in this town for 12 years, and I've learned that beauty and danger often go hand in hand in these mountains. There are bears, mountain lions, sudden weather changes that can trap a person miles from help." Clara sensed there was more to his concern than wildlife and weather. "I'm always careful to stay on the established trails, Sheriff, and I never venture out without telling Mrs. Murphy where I'm going." Davies nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "It's not just the natural dangers I'm worried about, Miss Bennet. It's that man who lives up there, Ezra Stone." At the mention of the name, Clara felt her heartbeat quicken slightly, though she kept her expression neutral. "Has he done something to warrant concern?" "It's not what he's done, it's what we don't know about him," Davies said, leaning forward in the small chair. "A man doesn't cut himself off from all human contact for 7 years without good reason. Maybe he's running from the law. Maybe he's lost his mind from living alone so long. Maybe he's just waiting for the right opportunity to cause trouble." Clara set down her pen and folded her hands in her lap. "Sheriff, has this man ever actually threatened anyone? Has he committed any crimes that you're aware of?" "Well, no," Davies admitted, "but that doesn't mean he's not dangerous. Jim Murphy, Mrs. Murphy's husband, saw him once about 3 years ago when he was hunting elk up near Copper Creek. Said the man was enormous, wild-looking, and carrying enough weapons to outfit a small army." "Hunting tools," Clara suggested gently. "If he lives off the land, he would need to be properly equipped." Davies studied her face carefully. "Miss Bennet, you seem remarkably sympathetic to a man you've never met." Clara chose her words with care. "I simply believe in giving people the benefit of the doubt until they prove themselves unworthy of it. From what you've told me, this Mr. Stone has been living peacefully in the mountains for years without bothering anyone. Peaceful isolation and dangerous unpredictability can look very similar from a distance," Davies warned. "The thing is, Miss Bennet, we don't know what might trigger a man like that, what might make him snap." That evening, Clara sat in her small room above the saloon, staring at the faded tintype photograph she had found tucked behind the mirror on her dressing table. The previous tenant must have left it behind, and Clara had been meaning to ask Mrs. Murphy about returning it to its owner. But tonight, in the lamplight, she studied the image more carefully. 2 men stood side by side outside what appeared to be a mine entrance, their arms around each other's shoulders, in the easy camaraderie of brothers. The taller man was unmistakably the person she had been encountering by the mountain stream, though his hair was shorter and his face fuller, lit by a genuine smile that transformed his entire appearance. Beside him stood a younger man, smaller in stature but radiating joy and confidence. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in careful script, "Ezra and David Stone, Copper Creek Mine, 1873. Clara's breath caught as she realized what she was looking at. This was Ezra Stone, before whatever tragedy had driven him into the mountains. The contrast between the happy, social man in the photograph and the solitary figure she knew was heartbreaking. Something terrible must have happened to transform him so completely. The next morning brought an unexpected visit from Mrs. Murphy, who climbed the stairs to Clara's room with obvious reluctance. "Clara, dear," she began, settling her considerable bulk into the room's single chair. "I've been hearing talk around town, and I think it's time someone spoke plainly with you." Clara looked up from her breakfast preparation, sensing another warning coming. "People are saying you've been seen regularly on the mountain trails," Mrs. Murphy continued. "Now, I'm not one to listen to gossip, but when it comes to your safety, I feel responsible. You're a young woman alone in a place where young women need to be especially careful. I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Murphy, but I assure you I'm being prudent." Mrs. Murphy shook her head. "It's not just about being prudent, dear. It's about understanding the kind of man you might encounter up there. I knew Ezra Stone before his troubles, and I can tell you he was as gentle as a lamb and twice as shy. But grief can change a person in ways that make them unrecognizable, even to themselves." Clara felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of troubles?" "His younger brother died in the mine collapse of '73, Mrs. Murphy said quietly. Ezra blamed himself, though anyone with sense could see it wasn't his fault. The mountain just took David, the way mountains sometimes do. But Ezra couldn't accept that. He stopped talking, stopped working, stopped being part of the world. One day he just walked up into those peaks and never came back down." Clara thought about the photograph in her dresser drawer, about the joy she had seen in both men's faces. How tragic for him. Tragic, yes, Mrs. Murphy agreed, but also dangerous in its own way. A man carrying that much guilt and pain, living alone with his thoughts for years. There's no telling what he might become. I'm not saying he would deliberately hurt anyone, but a wounded animal is unpredictable, and that's what he's become. One afternoon, Clara made her usual journey to the mountain stream, but this time she carried more than food and flowers. Tucked carefully in her bag was the photograph, wrapped in soft cloth to protect it from damage. She had no idea how Ezra would react to seeing this reminder of his past, but something told her that hiding from painful memories wasn't the same as healing from them. The morning Clara decided to leave the photograph by the stream, she found something waiting for her that made her heart skip with wonder. Placed carefully on their usual stone was a perfectly smooth river rock, no larger than her palm, but polished to such a lustrous finish that it seemed to glow in the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. Clara picked up the stone, marveling at its weight and the silky texture beneath her fingertips. This wasn't something that had been shaped by water alone. Someone had spent countless hours working this ordinary piece of granite into something extraordinary, rubbing it smooth with sand and patience until it became a thing of beauty. She understood the message immediately. This was Ezra's way of saying he valued their exchange, that her simple gifts had meant enough to him to inspire hours of careful work in return. The stone represented something precious, time freely given, effort invested in creating beauty for its own sake, the kind of patient attention that could only come from someone who had learned to find meaning in solitude. Clara placed her usual bundle of food beside the stone, but hesitated before adding the wrapped photograph. The image represented a painful chapter in Ezra's life, and she worried that returning it might cause more harm than healing. But something in the careful perfection of the polished stone convinced her that he was stronger than the townspeople believed, that confronting his past might be exactly what he needed. She unwrapped the tintype carefully and leaned against a small boulder, where it would be clearly visible, but protected from the wind. Then, after a moment's consideration, she added a brief note. I thought you might want this. The joy in both your faces speaks of wonderful memories that deserve to be treasured, not forgotten. For 3 days, Clara found no response at their meeting place. The photograph remained exactly where she had left it, untouched by weather or wildlife, as if even the mountain creatures understood its significance. Clara began to worry that she had overstepped some invisible boundary, that her well-meaning gesture had driven away the fragile connection they had been building. On the fourth morning, she discovered that everything had changed. The photograph was gone, but in its place lay an array of objects that took Clara's breath away. A family of wooden animals had been arranged in a small clearing beside the stream. A magnificent carved elk, with antlers so delicate they seemed ready to shed velvet. A pair of rabbits frozen in the moment before flight. A bear cub sitting upright with an expression of curious innocence. Each figure was perfect in its proportions, capturing not just the physical appearance of its living counterpart, but something essential about its spirit. But it was the newest addition that made Clara's eyes fill with tears. Beside the animal family sat a crude but unmistakable carving of two men standing together, their arms around each other's shoulders in obvious affection. The figures were rougher than Ezra's other work, carved with less precision but infinitely more emotion. One man was clearly taller than the other, and even in wood, their poses spoke of brotherhood and love. Clara understood that she was looking at something precious beyond measure, Ezra's attempt to carve his way back to a memory that brought joy instead of only pain. He had taken the photograph not to hide it away, but to use it as inspiration for creating something new from his grief. Over the following weeks, their silent conversations deepened and expanded. Clara began leaving longer notes, sharing stories about her students and her own life before coming to Cedar Ridge. She wrote about her childhood in Ohio, her decision to become a teacher, her dreams of making a difference in the lives of children who might otherwise be forgotten by the world. Ezra's responses came not in words but in increasingly personal gifts. He left bundles of medicinal herbs with small wooden tags carved to indicate their uses: willow bark for pain, echinacea for strength, chamomile for peaceful sleep. Clara realized he had been observing her more closely than she had imagined, noticing when she seemed tired or stressed, and responding with thoughtful remedies. One morning she found a collection of pressed wildflowers, each one perfectly preserved between thin sheets of bark and arranged according to color and season. Another day brought a small wooden box filled with unusual stones and crystals, each specimen carefully selected for its beauty or rarity. The attention to detail in every gift spoke of someone who had learned to find wonder in the natural world, who possessed both artistic skill and scientific curiosity. The most surprising discovery came on a crisp morning in late October. Clara approached their meeting place to find that someone had built a small shelter there, a simple lean-to constructed of carefully fitted branches and bark that would provide protection from rain or snow. Inside the shelter, arranged on a flat piece of slate, was a collection of small carved figurines that told the story of their growing friendship. A tiny wooden schoolhouse, a miniature loaf of bread, a carved flower that matched the columbine she had left on her very first visit. Clara sat inside the shelter for a long time that morning, surrounded by the evidence of someone's careful attention and growing trust. She understood that each carved figure represented a memory Ezra treasured, that their simple exchanges had become significant enough to him to deserve permanent commemoration in wood and stone. When she finally rose to leave, Clara placed her hand on one of the support posts of the shelter and whispered, "Thank you, Ezra. Thank you for letting me into your world." She had no way of knowing that 50 yards away, hidden among the dense pines, a tall figure stood watching her with eyes that had begun to remember what hope felt like. For the first time in 7 years, Ezra Stone had heard his name spoken aloud with kindness instead of fear, and the sound had awakened something in his heart that he had thought was dead forever. The storm arrived without warning on a Tuesday afternoon in early November, transforming the peaceful mountain landscape into a howling wilderness of wind and driving snow. Clara had dismissed her students early when the first dark clouds began building over the eastern peaks, but she had underestimated how quickly mountain weather could change from merely threatening to genuinely dangerous. She had intended to make a brief visit to her usual meeting place by the stream before the storm arrived in earnest. The morning had been crisp but clear, and Clara wanted to leave Ezra a small gift she had been working on for several evenings, a hand-stitched bookmark made from scraps of blue fabric, embroidered with tiny white flowers that matched the columbines they both treasured. But the weather turned savage with frightening speed. What had begun as light flurries became a driving blizzard that reduced visibility to mere yards. The wind howled through the pine trees with a voice like demons, and the temperature plummeted until Clara's breath formed clouds of vapor that froze on her woolen scarf. Clara tried to retrace her steps back toward town, but the familiar trail had been obliterated by blowing snow. The landmark she usually relied upon disappeared in the white chaos, and panic began to claw her chest as she realized she was lost in conditions that could kill an experienced woodsman, let alone a schoolteacher from Ohio. Her heavy woolen cloak, which had seemed perfectly adequate for a brief mountain walk, was no match for the ferocious wind. Snow found its way inside her collar and sleeves, melting against her skin and then freezing again in the brutal cold. Her fingers grew numb, despite her gloves, and her feet began to lose feeling inside her leather boots. Clara stumbled through the deepening drifts, calling out desperately for help, though she knew her voice would be swallowed by the storm's roar. Tree branches, heavy with snow and ice, cracked ominously overhead, and several times she was forced to dodge falling limbs that could have crushed her outright. As the afternoon wore on and the storm intensified, Clara began to understand that she was facing a life-threatening situation. The cold was seeping into her bones, and exhaustion made each step a monumental effort. She had heard stories of people found frozen to death just yards from safety, and the thought filled her with a terror that threatened to overwhelm her remaining rationality. It was then that she remembered the shelter Ezra had built near their meeting place. If she could find it, the simple lean-to might provide enough protection to keep her alive until the storm passed. But in the swirling chaos of wind and snow, every direction looked the same, and Clara had long since lost any sense of where she might be in relation to familiar landmarks. She pressed on through sheer determination, following what she hoped was still a trail, but might have been nothing more than a gap between trees. Her blue woolen ribbon, the one she had worn in her hair that morning, caught on a low branch and tore away in the wind, disappearing into the white void like a prayer flag torn from its moorings. Clara's legs finally gave out near what she thought might be the stream, though the water was invisible beneath a layer of snow and ice. She collapsed against a large boulder, her breathing labored and her vision beginning to blur from cold and exhaustion. The bookmark she had made for Ezra was still clutched in her numb fingers, its bright blue fabric now sodden with melted snow. She closed her eyes and tried to conserve what little body heat remained, pulling her cloak tighter around her shoulders and tucking her hands beneath her arms. The sound of the wind was hypnotic, almost peaceful in its relentless fury, and Clara found herself growing drowsy despite the mortal danger of falling asleep in such conditions. Through the storm's howl, she thought she heard something else, a deep rhythmic sound that might have been footsteps crunching through snow. But the wind played tricks with sound, and Clara had learned not to trust her senses in this white wilderness. She kept her eyes closed, focusing on staying conscious and maintaining what little warmth her body could still generate. The footsteps, if they had been real, stopped somewhere very close to where she huddled against the rock. Clara felt rather than saw a large presence nearby, a darkness that blocked some of the wind and snow from reaching her face. She forced her eyes open and found herself looking up at a figure that seemed too large to be entirely human. Ezra Stone stood above her like a mountain himself, his massive frame draped in a thick coat made from animal hides that shed the storm's fury like armor. His dark eyes, visible beneath the hood of his coat, held an expression of concern so profound it took Clara's breath away. Without a word, he knelt beside her and began to assess her condition with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood the mountain's capacity for sudden violence. Clara tried to speak, to thank him for finding her, but her lips were too numb to form words. Ezra seemed to understand her condition immediately. He lifted her as easily as if she were a child, cradling her against his chest, where the warmth of his body began to penetrate her frozen clothing. Through the driving snow, he carried her toward a destination she couldn't see but trusted him to find. Clara's last conscious thought before the cold and exhaustion claimed her was how safe she felt in the arms of the man everyone had warned her to fear. Clara awakened to warmth and the soft crackling of a wood fire, sensation so welcome after her ordeal in the storm that for a moment she thought she might be dreaming. She lay on something soft and comfortable, covered by what felt like the most luxurious blanket she had ever experienced. The air around her smelled of pine smoke, dried herbs, and something indefinably masculine that spoke of careful cleanliness rather than wilderness roughness. Slowly, carefully, she opened her eyes and found herself in a room unlike anything she had expected. Ezra's cabin was not the crude hovel the townspeople had described, but a testament to skilled craftsmanship and careful attention to detail. The walls were constructed of perfectly fitted logs, chinked with a mixture that kept out every breath of wind. The wooden floor was smooth and clean, covered here and there with beautifully woven rugs that must have taken months to complete. Clara realized she was lying on a narrow bed built into one corner of the single room, its frame crafted from the same careful joinery that characterized everything else in the space. The blanket covering her was a magnificent quilt, hand-stitched in a pattern of stars and flowers that spoke of feminine hands and patient love. The fabric was soft with age but immaculately maintained, and Clara understood she was looking at something precious, probably the work of Ezra's mother, or perhaps a woman he had once hoped to marry. The cabin's interior revealed a life lived with purpose and dignity. Despite its isolation, shelves lined one wall, filled with books on subjects ranging from botany to philosophy, their leather bindings worn smooth by careful handling. A sturdy table occupied the center of the room, its surface marked by years of use, but kept scrupulously clean. Hand-carved wooden bowls and plates were arranged neatly on open shelves, along with various tools and implements that showed the marks of constant use and careful maintenance. In one corner stood a wood-burning stove that radiated gentle heat throughout the space, its chimney pipe disappearing through the roof in a configuration that spoke of engineering skill. Beside it, a neat stack of split wood testified to hours of preparation for the harsh mountain winter. The windows, though small, were fitted with real glass and framed with shutters that could be closed against the worst weather. But it was the small details that revealed the most about the man who lived here. Carved wooden figures occupied places of honor on the mantelpiece above the stove. Animals, trees, and human forms that captured life with startling accuracy. A collection of pressed flowers and leaves, mounted between sheets of glass, decorated one wall like natural artwork. Books lay open on the table, marked with careful notes in the margins that revealed a mind still actively engaged with ideas and learning. Clara became aware of movement near the stove and turned her head to see Ezra tending a kettle that hung over the fire. He had removed his heavy winter coat and stood in simple wool pants and a flannel shirt that revealed the true magnitude of his frame. His hair, now that she could see it clearly, was neatly trimmed and clean, streaked with premature gray that made him look distinguished rather than wild. His beard, while full, was carefully maintained and shaped. When he noticed she was awake, Ezra's movements became more cautious, like those of a man unused to having another person share his space. He ladled something fragrant from the kettle into a wooden cup and approached the bed slowly, his dark eyes never leaving her face. Clara tried to sit up, but dizziness and lingering weakness from her ordeal made the movement difficult. Ezra immediately set down the cup and moved to help her, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he supported her back and adjusted the pillows behind her. His touch was careful, respectful, the contact lasting no longer than necessary to ensure her comfort. "Thank you," Clara whispered, her voice hoarse from cold and exhaustion. "You saved my life." Ezra's eyes widened at the sound of her voice, and Clara saw something flicker across his features that might have been surprise or perhaps longing. He handed her the cup, which contained an herbal tea that warmed her from the inside, and carried flavors of mint, honey, and something else she couldn't identify but found deeply soothing. As Clara sipped the tea, she studied Ezra's face and saw past the intimidating size and wild appearance to something much more complex. His eyes held intelligence and kindness, shadowed by deep sadness, but not the madness or danger the townspeople had described. This was a man who had chosen isolation, not from hatred of humanity, but from some profound wound that had never properly healed. "Your home is beautiful," Clara said softly, gesturing with her free hand at the carefully crafted interior. "Everything shows such skill and care." Ezra's gaze followed her gesture, and Clara saw what might have been pride flicker across his features. He nodded slightly, the first direct acknowledgement he had given to any of her words. Clara noticed a familiar object on the table across the room, the blue bookmark she had been carrying when the storm caught her, now cleaned and carefully smoothed flat. Beside it lay several other items she recognized from their exchanges: the pressed flowers, the wooden animals, even the photograph of Ezra and his brother, now mounted in a simple wooden frame. The realization hit her with unexpected force. This man treasured their connection as much as she did. Every gift she had left, every note she had written, had been brought here and given a place of honor in his carefully ordered world. She wasn't just an amusing diversion for a lonely hermit. She had somehow become important to him, significant enough to display the evidence of their friendship like precious relics. "You kept everything," Clara murmured, her eyes filling with tears at the thought of how much their simple exchanges had meant to someone who had been cut off from human kindness for so long. Ezra followed her gaze to the collection on his table, and for the first time since she had awakened, Clara saw him smile. It was barely more than a slight lifting of the corners of his mouth, but it transformed his entire face and gave her a glimpse of the man he had been before tragedy reshaped his life. As Clara grew stronger over the next 2 days, confined to Ezra's cabin while the storm raged outside, she began to notice details that painted a clearer picture of the man who had saved her life. Hidden in a wooden box beneath the window, she glimpsed the edge of what appeared to be letters, their paper yellowed with age and their edges worn from repeated handling. On the second evening, as Ezra prepared their simple dinner of venison stew and fresh bread he had baked in a Dutch oven, Clara's curiosity finally overcame her natural politeness. "Ezra," she said gently, using his name for the first time in his presence, "may I ask you about those letters?" The effect was immediate and dramatic. Ezra's hands stilled on the wooden spoon he was using to stir the stew, and his shoulders tensed as if he had been struck. For a long moment he stood frozen at the stove, his back to Clara, while the fire crackled and the wind howled outside the sturdy walls. When he finally turned to face her, Clara saw pain so raw and profound in his dark eyes that she almost regretted asking, but there was something else there too. A desperate need to finally share the burden he had been carrying alone for 7 years. Ezra moved to the wooden box with the slow, careful steps of a man approaching something that might explode. He lifted out a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, their surfaces covered with careful handwriting in brown ink. His massive hands trembled slightly as he untied the ribbon and selected one letter from the collection. Instead of handing it to Clara, he sat heavily at the table and spread the letter flat before him, his eyes scanning words he had obviously read countless times before. Clara could see that the paper was crumpled and stained, as if it had been balled up in frustration and then smoothed out again with desperate care. "I wrote this 3 years ago," Ezra said, his voice so quiet. Clara had to strain to hear it. The sound of him speaking was startling, his words rusty from disuse, but carrying a cultured accent that spoke of education and refinement. "And this one 2 years ago, and this one last winter." He indicated the other letters in the bundle, each one showing similar signs of having been written, crumpled, and preserved, despite their author's obvious dissatisfaction with their contents. "They're all to the same person," Ezra continued, his finger tracing the address written in his careful script. "Mrs. Margaret Stone, Denver, Colorado, David's widow." Clara's breath caught as she understood what she was seeing. These were letters to his brother's wife, attempts to reach out across the gulf of grief and guilt that had separated him from his family. "I could never find the right words," Ezra said, his voice breaking slightly. "How do you tell a woman that you failed to save her husband? How do you explain that you were supposed to protect him, and instead you let him die?" Clara moved carefully from the bed to sit across from Ezra at the table, her heart aching for the pain she could see etched in every line of his face. "Ezra, what happened to David wasn't your fault." "You don't understand," Ezra said, his voice growing stronger with the force of his anguish. "I was the experienced miner. I was supposed to watch out for him. I knew that section of the mine was unstable, but I let them assign him there anyway. I should have insisted he work with me, should have refused to let him go into that tunnel." Clara reached across the table and gently touched the edge of one of the letters. "What do these letters say?" Ezra picked up the most recent letter with shaking hands and began to read aloud, his voice thick with emotion. "Dear Margaret, I hope this letter finds you and little Samuel in good health. I know it has been too long since David's death, and I know you must wonder why I disappeared from your life when you needed support the most. The truth is that I cannot face you because I cannot face myself. David died because of my failures, and I have spent these years trying to find a way to live with that knowledge. I think of you and Samuel every day, and I pray that you have found happiness despite the loss I caused. I have nothing to offer except my deepest sorrow and my promise that I will never stop missing my brother. Your devoted brother-in-law, Ezra." When he finished reading, Ezra's composure finally broke completely. 7 years of suppressed grief poured out of him in great, racking sobs that shook his massive frame. Clara had never witnessed such raw anguish in another human being, and she felt her own eyes fill with tears at the magnitude of his pain. Without thinking, she rose and moved around the table to place her hand gently on Ezra's shoulder. He didn't pull away from her touch, though his body remained rigid with the effort of containing emotions too large for any single person to bear. "Ezra," Clara said softly, "have you ever sent any of these letters?" He shook his head without looking up. "I could never mail them. What if she wrote back? What if she told me she agreed that it was my fault? What if she said she never wanted to see me again?" Clara knelt beside his chair, bringing herself to his eye level. "And what if she told you that she misses you? What if she said that Samuel asks about his uncle Ezra and wonders why you disappeared? What if she needs your support as much as you need her?" For the first time since he had begun speaking, Rara looked directly at Clara. His eyes were red with tears. But there was something else there now, a tiny spark of hope that had been buried but not extinguished by years of self-imposed isolation. "She was David's whole world," Ezra whispered, "and Samuel is just a baby, growing up without ever knowing how wonderful his father was. They deserve better than a broken man who couldn't save the person they both loved most." Clara took Ezra's large hands in both of hers, feeling the calluses and scars that spoke of years of hard work and harder living. "Ezra, you're not broken, you're grieving, and you're lonely, and you've been carrying a burden that was never entirely yours to bear. But you're not broken." That night, as the storm finally began to subside outside, Clara watched Ezra carefully fold the letters and return them to their box. But she noticed that he left one letter out on the table, smoothing its wrinkled surface with gentle fingers, as if considering, perhaps for the first time in years, the possibility that some words were better spoken than forever, held in silence. The morning after the storm brought crystalline sunlight and air so clear it seemed to magnify every detail of the mountain landscape. Clara felt strong enough to venture outside, and Ezra had agreed to escort her back toward town, though she sensed his reluctance to leave the sanctuary of his cabin and the safety of their private world. As they prepared for the journey, Clara noticed Ezra making small sounds she had never heard from him before. He hummed softly while packing supplies for their walk, a wordless melody that spoke of contentment despite his obvious nervousness about venturing closer to civilization. When he accidentally dropped a piece of equipment, he made a small grunt of frustration, then seemed surprised at himself for making any sound at all. "You have a beautiful voice," Clara said gently, as they set out along the snow-covered trail. "I hope you know." Ezra's response was a barely audible sigh, but Clara caught the pleased expression that flickered across his features before he looked away. She realized that these small vocalizations represented enormous progress for a man who had maintained complete silence for 7 years. Each sound was a tentative step back toward the world of human communication. Their descent through the mountains revealed the storm's dramatic impact on the landscape. Trees groaned under the weight of heavy snow, and icicles hung like crystal daggers from rocky outcroppings. But the beauty was breathtaking, and Clara found herself stopping frequently to admire views that seemed painted by an artist with an unlimited palette of whites and blues. Ezra proved to be a patient guide, adjusting his naturally long stride to match Clara's shorter steps and pausing whenever she needed to rest or simply wanted to appreciate their surrounding sounds. He seemed to know every boulder and tree along the route, navigating with the confidence of someone who had walked these trails in all seasons and weather conditions. As they traveled, Clara began sharing stories about her life, filling the comfortable silence with gentle conversation that required no response but seemed to please Ezra nonetheless. She told him about her students, describing Tommy's struggles with arithmetic and Sarah's surprising talent for storytelling. She spoke about her childhood in Ohio, her decision to become a teacher, and her hopes for making a difference in the lives of frontier children. Ezra listened with the focused attention of someone unused to hearing about the outside world, his dark eyes reflecting genuine interest in her words. Occasionally he would nod or make a small sound of agreement, and Clara began to recognize these responses as his way of participating in their conversation, without yet trusting himself to use actual words. When they stopped to rest beside a frozen waterfall, Clara noticed Ezra examining something in his coat pocket. He pulled out a small wooden object and held it uncertainly, as if debating whether to show it to her. After a moment's hesitation, he extended his hand to reveal a carved toy horse, no larger than Clara's palm, but exquisitely detailed. The little horse was clearly meant for a child, with gentle eyes and a flowing mane that invited small hands to explore its smooth surfaces. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, showing the same attention to detail that characterized all of Ezra's work, but there was something different about this piece. It carried an emotional weight that spoke of specific purpose and deep meaning. Clara accepted the carved horse carefully, turning it over in her hands to admire the artistry. "This is beautiful, Ezra. Did you make it for someone special?" Ezra's expression grew distant, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "For Samuel, David's boy. He would be old enough now to appreciate toys." Clara felt her heart constrict at the longing in Ezra's voice. "You've never met your nephew." Ezra shook his head, his eyes fixed on the carved horse in Clara's hands. "He was born just 2 months after David died. Margaret sent word through the mine office, but I had already stopped talking to people. I never went to see him. So Samuel has never known his uncle Ezra. He doesn't even know I exist," Ezra said, the words heavy with regret. "Margaret probably assumes I'm dead, or that I simply didn't care enough to be part of their lives." Clara studied the little horse, noting how the wood had been polished smooth by countless hours of handling. "How long have you been carrying this?" "I carved it for his first birthday," Ezra admitted. "I thought maybe I would find the courage to visit them, to apologize and try to be the uncle David would have wanted me to be. But every time I considered making the journey to Denver, the fear stopped me." "What kind of fear?" Ezra was quiet for so long that Clara wondered if he would answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a pain so profound it made her want to weep. "Fear that they would look at me and see the man who failed to save their husband and father. Fear that Samuel would grow up knowing his uncle Ezra was a coward who abandoned his family when they needed him most. Fear that I would disappoint them the way I disappointed David." Clara handed the horse back to Ezra, but covered his large hands with both of hers as he accepted it. "Ezra, you could never disappoint a child by showing him love, and you could never disappoint Margaret by proving that you cared about David's memory." As they resumed their journey toward town, Clara noticed that Ezra continued to hold the wooden horse, his thumb running over its carved mane in a gesture that spoke of years of hope and regret. She began to understand that healing would require more than just learning to speak again. It would mean finding the courage to reconnect with the family he had loved and lost through his own overwhelming grief. When the rooftops of Cedar Ridge came into view through the trees, Ezra stopped walking and turned to Clara with an expression of gratitude, mixed with something that might have been affection. "Thank you," he said, his voice stronger than she had heard it before, "for listening, for understanding, for not being afraid of me." Clara smiled up at him, feeling the warmth of connection that had grown between them over their days together. "Thank you for saving my life, Ezra, and for trusting me with yours." Clara's return to Cedar Ridge after 3 days missing in the mountains created a sensation that rippled through the small community like stones thrown into still water. Mrs. Murphy wept openly when Clara walked through the door of the saloon, and Sheriff Davies immediately launched into a detailed account of the search parties that had been organized despite the dangerous weather conditions. "We were preparing for the worst," the sheriff admitted, his weathered face showing genuine relief. "That storm was the worst we've seen this early in the season. How on earth did you survive?" Clara chose her words carefully, aware that her answer would determine how the townspeople viewed both her judgment and Ezra's character. "I found shelter in a cave until the weather passed," she said, which was true enough without revealing the full extent of Ezra's kindness. But her explanation satisfied no one, particularly Mrs. Murphy, who possessed the sharp instincts of someone who had raised 4 children and managed a frontier business for 2 decades. "Clara, dear," Mrs. Murphy said once they were alone in the kitchen, "your clothes were clean when you came back, and you look better fed than when you left. Caves don't provide hot meals and laundry service." Before Clara could respond, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of 3 strangers who pushed through the saloon's front door with the aggressive confidence of men accustomed to taking what they wanted. They were clearly drifters, the kind of men who moved from town to town seeking easy opportunities and quick profits. The leader was a lean man, with pale eyes and a scraggly beard, his clothes expensive but dirty, suggesting someone who had once known better circumstances. His companions were larger and more obviously dangerous, their hands resting casually near the guns at their hips in a way that spoke of experience with violence. "Afternoon, ladies," the leader said, his voice carrying a false politeness that made Clara's skin crawl. "Beautiful town you have here. Very peaceful, very isolated." Mrs. Murphy stepped slightly in front of Clara, her maternal instincts recognizing a threat even before it was clearly articulated. "Can I help you gentlemen with something?" "Just looking around, making acquaintances," the man replied, his pale eyes fixed on Clara with an intensity that made her deeply uncomfortable. "This is a schoolteacher, isn't it? Pretty young woman like this, all alone in the mountains. That seems dangerous." Clara felt her heartbeat quicken, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm perfectly safe here, thank you." "Oh, I'm sure you are," the man said, stepping closer despite Mrs. Murphy's obvious displeasure. "But accidents happen, don't they? Pretty women get lost, get hurt, disappear entirely, especially when they go wandering around by themselves in places they don't belong." The threat was unmistakable, delivered with a smile that made it even more chilling. Clara understood that these men had been watching the town, learning about its residents and their routine. They knew she walked alone in the mountains, and they were letting her know that her isolation made her vulnerable. Sheriff Davies chose that moment to enter the saloon, his hand resting on his gun belt in a gesture that suggested he had already assessed the situation. "Everything all right here, Mrs. Murphy? These gentlemen were just leaving," Mrs. Murphy said firmly, her Irish accent becoming more pronounced as it always did when she was angry. The leader laughed, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. "Of course we just wanted to meet the locals. Let them know we'll be camping nearby for a few days. Beautiful country around here. Perfect for hunting." After the strangers left, Clara found herself shaking with reaction to the implied threat. She had encountered difficult men before, but never ones who radiated such casual menace. The way they had looked at her, spoken to her, made it clear that they viewed her as potential prey rather than a person deserving of respect. "Those men are trouble," Sheriff Davies said grimly. "I'll keep an eye on them, but Miss Bennett, I strongly suggest you avoid your mountain walks until they move on." Clara nodded, but privately she wondered how she would explain a sudden change in her routine to Ezra. Their daily meetings had become precious to both of them, and she feared that breaking the pattern might cause him to retreat back into complete isolation. That evening, as Clara prepared for bed in her small room above the saloon, she noticed shadows moving outside her window. When she peered through the curtains, she saw one of the strangers standing in the alley below, his face tilted up toward her window with an expression that made her blood run cold. She quickly extinguished her lamp and moved away from the window, her heart pounding with the realization that the threat was more serious than she had initially understood. These men weren't just passing through. They were studying the town's routines, identifying potential victims, planning something that would require Clara to be very, very careful. What Clara didn't know was that 50 yards away, hidden in the darkness between two buildings, another figure watched the man watching her window. Ezra had followed Clara partway back to town that morning, unable to completely let go of his need to ensure her safety. His hunter's instincts had detected the presence of the strangers before anyone in town realized they were being observed. Ezra had spent years living like a wild animal, alert to every sound and movement in his territory. He recognized predators when he saw them, and everything about these three men screamed danger. The way they moved, the way they watched, the way they spoke to Clara with barely concealed aggression triggered protective instincts in Ezra that had been dormant since David's death. For the first time in 7 years, Ezra Stone felt the stirring of something stronger than grief and self-recrimination. Watching a stranger threaten the woman who had brought light back into his dark world awakened a fierce protectiveness that made his hands clench into fists and brought a low growl to his throat. The sound surprised him, this vocal expression of anger and determination, but it also felt right, felt like the beginning of something that had been sleeping too long in his damaged heart. For 3 days after the stranger's arrival, Clara found herself trapped in an uncomfortable routine of constant vigilance. She varied her routes between the schoolhouse and Miss Murphy's establishment, never walking the same path twice in succession. She made sure to travel only during daylight hours and always within sight of other townspeople. Most importantly, she avoided her cherished morning walks to the mountain stream, knowing that her absence would worry Ezra, but afraid to risk the isolation that such journeys require. The strangers had made themselves a presence in Cedar Ridge without quite crossing the line into obvious criminality. They purchased supplies at the general store, drank at Miss Murphy's saloon, and even attended Sunday services at the small Methodist church, sitting in the back pew with expressions of pious respectability that fooled no one who looked into their cold eyes. But Clara noticed how they watched her. When she walked to the schoolhouse, one of them would inevitably appear on the street, ostensibly engaged in some innocent activity, but positioned where he could observe her movement. When she worked late grading papers, shadows would move past the windows in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be coincidental. On Wednesday afternoon, Clara made a decision that went against every warning she had received. The absence of her morning ritual was affecting her deeply, and she worried constantly about Ezra's reaction to her sudden disappearance from their usual meeting place. She imagined him waiting by the stream, wondering if he had somehow driven her away, retreating back into the isolation that had nearly destroyed him. Clara chose a route she had never used before, circling wide around the town's perimeter and approaching the mountain trail from an unexpected direction. She moved carefully through the forest, pausing frequently to listen for sounds of pursuit and choosing paths that would be difficult for someone unfamiliar with the terrain to follow. When she finally reached their meeting place by the stream, Clara found evidence that Ezra had indeed been waiting for her. Fresh offerings lay on their usual stone, carved wooden figures, bundles of useful herbs, and a new addition that made her heart ache with its implications. A small wooden whistle, perfectly crafted and clearly meant to be used as a signal device, lay beside a note written in Ezra's careful script. "If you are in danger, use this, I will come." Clara picked up the whistle with trembling hands, understanding that Ezra had somehow sensed her absence was due to more than a simple change in routine. His note revealed not only his concern for her safety, but his willingness to risk his own security to help her if needed. She left her own note in return, carefully explaining about the dangerous men in town and her fear of leading them to Ezra's sanctuary. She tried to reassure him that she was safe but cautious, and that she hoped to resume their meetings once the threat had passed. Clara was so focused on writing her explanation that she didn't hear the approach of footsteps until it was too late to escape. The leader of the three strangers emerged from the tray line behind her, his pale eyes bright with satisfaction at having finally cornered his prey. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying that same false politeness that had chilled her in the saloon. "The pretty schoolteacher does have secrets after all. Who would have thought to look for you way up here?" Clara's hand closed around the wooden whistle, but she didn't dare raise it to her lips while the man was watching. Instead, she tried to project a confidence she didn't feel. "I'm just enjoying the mountain air. There's nothing secretive about that." "Oh, I think there is," the man said, stepping closer and forcing Clara to back toward the stream. "I think you have been meeting someone up here. Someone you don't want the good people of Cedar Ridge to know about." "You're mistaken," Clara said, but her voice betrayed her fear. "Am I?" The stranger picked up one of Ezra's carved figures from the stone, examining it with exaggerated interest. "This is fine work. Not the sort of thing a schoolteacher could afford to buy. Someone's been giving you gifts, haven't they?" Clara realized with growing terror that the man had been watching her longer than she had suspected, probably following her on previous visits to the stream. He knew about her meetings with Ezra, and worse, he seemed to view them as leverage he could use against her. "Here's what's going to happen," the man continued, his false politeness finally dropping away to reveal the predator beneath. "You're going to come back to town with me, quietly and without making any fuss. And if you're very cooperative, perhaps I won't feel the need to share what I've learned about your secret mountain romance with Sheriff Davies." The threat was clear: comply with his demands or face public shame and the destruction of Ezra's carefully guarded privacy. Clara felt trapped between impossible choices, knowing that any action she took might lead to disaster for the man who had saved her life and shown her such patient kindness. It was then that she heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very mountains themselves. The sound was unlike anything she had ever heard from a human throat, more animal than man, carrying a threat so primal and fierce that it made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The stranger heard it too, his confident expression faltering as he looked around for the source of the sound. His hand moved instinctively toward the gun at his hip, but the growl came again, closer this time, and somehow conveying a promise of violence that made Clara's knees weak with relief. From the dense shadows between the trees, Ezra Stone emerged like a force of nature itself. His massive frame seemed even larger than Clara remembered, and his dark eyes held a fury that transformed his usually gentle features into something genuinely terrifying. In his right hand, he carried a hunting knife with a blade that gleamed like silver fire in the dappled sunlight. The stranger took one look at this apparition and made the wise decision to run, crashing through the underbrush in his haste to escape. His flight was accompanied by another of those inhuman growls from Ezra, a sound that promised pursuit and consequences if the threat ever returned. When the sounds of the stranger's panicked retreat had faded into the distance, Ezra turned to Clara with eyes that still blazed with protective fury. For the first time since David's death, he had found something worth fighting for, and the realization was both terrifying and liberating. Clara collapsed onto a fallen log beside the stream, her legs suddenly too weak to support her after the confrontation. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the terrifying encounter was draining away, leaving her shaking and nauseous. Ezra approached her cautiously, his fury gradually subsiding as he saw how badly the incident had affected her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion, but unmistakably concerned. The words came more easily now, as if the protective rage had burned away some of the barriers that had kept him silent for so long. Clara shook her head. not trusting herself to speak without breaking down completely. Ezra knelt beside her, his large presence both comforting and reassuring. After a moment's hesitation, he placed one gentle hand on her shoulder, the contact meant to steady and support rather than claim or possess. "That man won't come back," Ezra said with quiet certainty. "Men like that are cowards at heart. They prey on those they think are defenseless, but they run when they face real opposition." "How did you know I was in danger?" Clara finally managed to ask. Ezra looked somewhat embarrassed. "I've been watching, following you at a distance when you walked back to town. I know it's not proper, but after that storm, I couldn't bear the thought of something happening to you when I might have prevented it." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes, touched by this evidence of Ezra's growing attachment to her. The idea that he had been silently protecting her, risking his own carefully maintained isolation to ensure her safety, spoke of feelings he wasn't yet ready to articulate. "I'm grateful," she whispered. "More grateful than you know." As they sat together in the peaceful clearing, Clara became aware that something fundamental had changed in their relationship. Ezra's willingness to confront another human being, to make his presence known, and even speak in her defense, represented an enormous step away from the complete withdrawal that had characterized his life since David's death. But 2 days later, Clara's world shifted again, when she began experiencing severe headaches that left her dizzy and nauseous. She had always been prone to such episodes during times of stress, but these were worse than anything she had experienced before. The pain behind her eyes was so intense that bright light became unbearable, and she found herself struggling to focus on even simple tasks. Mrs. Murphy noticed Clara's distress immediately when she appeared at breakfast on Friday morning, her face pale and her hands trembling as she tried to drink her coffee. "You look terrible, dear," Mrs. Murphy said bluntly. "These past few days have been too much for you. You need rest and probably a doctor." Clara tried to protest that she was fine, but a wave of dizziness forced her to grip the edge of the table to keep from falling. Miss Murphy immediately helped her back to her room, where Clara collapsed on her narrow bed with a groan of relief at being horizontal. "I have some laudanum that might help with the pain," Mrs. Murphy offered, producing a small brown bottle from her apron pocket. "Morrison left it for emergencies, but I think this qualifies." The medicine helped somewhat, but Clara remained bedridden for the next 2 days, drifting in and out of sleep, while Mrs. Murphy checked on her regularly. What worried Clara most wasn't the physical discomfort, but her complete inability to get word to Ezra about her condition. She knew he would be waiting at their usual meeting place, probably growing more concerned with each day of her absence. On Sunday evening, Clara's condition took a turn for the worse. The headache that had been manageable with laudanum suddenly intensified to an unbearable level, and she developed a high fever that left her delirious and barely conscious. Mrs. Murphy took one look at Clara's flushed face and dilated pupils and made an immediate decision. "I'm sending for Dr. Morrison," she announced, though the doctor lived 20 miles away in the county seat and would take hours to reach Cedar Ridge, even if he could be found immediately. But before Mrs. Murphy could organize a messenger, she heard heavy footsteps on the stairs leading to Clara's room. She turned in surprise to see Sheriff Davies emerging from the stairwell, followed by the most unlikely visitor imaginable. Ezra Stone filled the narrow hallway, his massive frame bent slightly to avoid hitting his head on the low ceiling. His usual careful grooming had been abandoned, his hair wild and his clothes disheveled, as if he had been running through the forest. His dark eyes held a desperation that made Miss Murphy step back involuntarily. "Where is she?" Ezra demanded, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "Clara? Where is Clara?" Sheriff Davies looked as stunned as Mrs. Murphy felt. "Ezra, my God, man, we haven't seen you in town for 7 years. What are you doing here?" "Clara hasn't come to our meeting place for 3 days," Ezra said, his words rushing together in his urgency. "Something's wrong. I can feel it. Where is she?" Mrs. Murphy found herself pointing toward Clara's door without conscious thought, responding to the raw need in Ezra's voice. "She's very ill, high fever, terrible headaches. I was just about to send for the doctor." Ezra pushed past them both and entered Clara's room, his size making the small space seem even more cramped. Clara lay on her narrow bed, her face flushed with fever and her breathing shallow and rapid. When Ezra saw her condition, a sound escaped him that was part groan and part growl, the voice of a man watching something precious slip away from him. "Help her," he said, turning to Mrs. Murphy with eyes that held a plea more eloquent than any words. "Please, help her." Mrs. Murphy studied Ezra's face and saw past the wild appearance to something she recognized, a man desperately afraid of losing someone he loved. Her maternal instincts, which had guided her through raising 4 children and countless crises, told her that this giant of a man posed no threat to anyone except those who might threaten Clara. "Can you ride?" she asked him. "Morrison is in Millerville, but if you take my fastest horse, you could reach him in 2 hours instead of 4. Ezra nodded immediately. "Tell me how to find him." As Mrs. Murphy gave Ezra directions to the doctor's house, Sheriff Davies watched in amazement. This was not the dangerous hermit the townspeople had imagined, but a man whose long isolation had been broken by love and fear for another person's well-being. "Bring him back quickly," Ezra said, his voice breaking slightly on the words. "She has to be all right. She has to be." And with that, the man who hadn't spoken to another human being for 7 years rode out into the night, trusting strangers to care for the woman who had taught him to hope again. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness for the next 3 days, dimly aware of voices around her bed and gentle hands that tended to her fever with cool cloths and careful ministration. In her delirium, she thought she heard Ezra's voice, low and soothing, reading aloud from what sounded like familiar passages from her Bible. When her fever finally broke on Wednesday morning, Clara wakened to find herself in her small room above the saloon, but the space had been transformed. Fresh wildflowers filled mason jars on the windowsill, and someone had arranged her few books on the bedside table where she could easily reach them. Most surprising of all, a large wooden chair had been positioned beside her bed, clearly built to accommodate someone of unusual size. As Clara's vision cleared, she realized she was not alone. Ezra sat in the oversized chair, his massive frame folded uncomfortably into a position that allowed him to watch over her while she slept. His hair had been trimmed and his beard neatly groomed, and he wore clean clothes that suggested someone had been taking care of his appearance as well as hers. "You're awake," he said, and Clara was startled by how natural his voice sounded, as if the crisis had burned away the last of his hesitation about speaking. "How do you feel?" Clara tried to sit up, but dizziness forced her to remain prone. "Weak," she admitted, "but better." "How long was I unconscious?" 3 days, Ezra said, leaning forward to study her face with obvious concern. "Dr. Morrison said it was mountain fever, brought on by stress and exhaustion. He was worried we might lose you." "We?" Ezra's expression grew sheepish. "Miss Murphy, Sheriff Davies and I. We've been taking turns watching over you. The doctor said someone should be here constantly in case your condition changed." Clara could hardly believe what she was hearing. "Ezra, you've been staying in town?" "For 3 days. I couldn't leave you," he said simply. "Not when you were so sick. Not when it might be my fault for failing to protect you from those men." Clara reached out and touched Ezra's hand, marveling at how easily the contact came now, how natural it felt to offer comfort to this man who had been caring for her. "It wasn't your fault, and you did protect me. You saved me from that horrible man." Ezra turned his hand palm up to capture her fingers gently. "Clara, I need to tell you something. While you were unconscious, delirious with fever, you spoke about many things, but mostly you called for me. You kept saying my name, asking where I was, begging me not to leave you alone." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with fever. "I don't remember. Dr. Morrison said delirium often reveals a person's deepest concerns," Ezra continued, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "It made me realize that I've been selfish, hiding in the mountains while you've been trying to heal my heart from a distance. You've given me so much, and I've offered you nothing in return except carved trinkets and my cowardice." "That's not true," Clara protested. "You've given me friendship, protection, beauty. I've given you secrets and silence, Ezra interrupted, but these past few days, talking to Mrs. Murphy and Sheriff Davies, even Dr. Morrison, I've remembered what it feels like to be part of a community again. I'd forgotten that people could be kind, that they could accept someone who's made mistakes and lost his way. Clara squeezed his hand, understanding that something profound had shifted during her illness. What do you say? Ezra was quiet for a long moment, gathering courage for words that would change everything between them. I'm saying that I don't want to hide anymore. I don't want to meet you in secret places and communicate through gifts and letters. I want to be part of your world, part of this town, part of life again. And what changed your mind? Nearly losing you, Ezra said, his voice breaking slightly. Sitting here for 3 days, watching you fight for your life, made me realize that love isn't about protecting yourself from pain. It's about risking everything for someone else's happiness. Clara's breath caught at his use of the word love, the first time either of them had spoken it aloud. Ezra, I love you, Clara, he said, the words coming more easily now that he had found the courage to begin. I think I started loving you the first morning I found bread and flowers by the stream, when I realized that someone in this world was kind enough to care about a stranger's hunger, but I was too afraid to admit it, even to myself. Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks as she heard the words she had hardly dared hope for. I love you too, she whispered. I have for weeks, maybe since that first day when I saw the sadness in your eyes and knew you weren't the dangerous creature everyone believed you to be. Ezra lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to Clara's knuckles, a gesture so tender it made her heart ache with happiness. When you're stronger, when you're well enough to leave this room, will you walk with me through the town? Will you let people see us together? Let them know that the mountain man and the schoolteacher have found something worth coming down from the hills for. Clara smiled through her tears, imagining the sensation their public appearance would create in Cedar Ridge. Are you ready for that kind of attention? I'm ready for anything, as long as it means I don't have to face it alone, Ezra said. You've taught me that isolation isn't safety, it's just another kind of death. I want to live again, Clara. I want to live with you. As if summoned by their conversation, Mrs. Murphy appeared in the doorway carrying a tray of soup and fresh bread. She took one look at their joined hands and Clara's tear-streaked but smiling face, and her own expression brightened with maternal satisfaction. Well, she said briskly, setting down the tray and smoothing Clara's coverlet with businesslike efficiency. It's about time you two figured out what the rest of us have known for weeks. Now, Clara, you need to eat something to rebuild your strength. And Ezra, you need to get some proper sleep in a real bed instead of that chair. There's plenty of time for romance once our patient is back on her feet. But as Mrs. Murphy bustled around the room, Clara caught Ezra's eye and saw the promise there. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, no longer hiding from the world or from their own hearts. 2 weeks after Clara's recovery, she felt strong enough to venture back to their special place by the mountain stream. Ezra had visited her daily in town, gradually becoming a familiar sight on Cedar Ridge's main street as the townspeople adjusted to his presence among them. But this morning, Clara wanted to return to where their friendship had begun, to show Ezra how much their secret sanctuary still meant to her, despite their newfound openness. The autumn air was crisp and clean, with golden leaves drifting down from the aspen trees like nature's confetti. Clara had packed a simple picnic lunch, including some of Mrs. Murphy's fresh bread and a jar of honey, recreating in spirit her very first gift to the mysterious mountain man who had seemed so unreachable then. Ezra walked beside her with easy confidence, no longer the haunted figure who had fled at the first sight of another human being. His transformation over the past weeks had been remarkable to witness. He spoke freely now, sharing observations about the changing season and pointing out wildlife signs that Clara's untrained eye would have missed entirely. There, he said, stopping to examine marks on a tree trunk. Bare claws. A female with cubs. By the space, she's been marking territory, warning other bears to stay away from her family. Clara studied the scratches, marveling at how Ezra could read the forest like a book written in a language she was only beginning to understand. "How can you tell? It's a female with cubs. The height of the marks and the way they're clustered together," Ezra explained patiently. "A solitary bear would mark higher, more aggressively, but a mother bear marks to establish boundaries, not to challenge. She's trying to keep her cubs safe, not looking for a fight." When they reached their familiar clearing by the stream, Clara was delighted to find that Ezra had made improvements to the small shelter he had built there. The lean-to had been expanded and reinforced, with a stone-lined fire pit added nearby and logs arranged to create comfortable seating. It was clear he had spent considerable time making the space more welcoming, perhaps hoping for exactly this sort of return visit. "You've been busy," Clara observed, settling onto one of the smooth log seats Ezra had positioned to take advantage of the best view of the stream. "I hoped we might come back here together someday," Ezra admitted, unpacking their lunch with the careful attention to detail that characterized everything he did. "This place is where I started to believe in hope again, where I remembered that life could hold beauty instead of just survival." Clara watched Ezra arrange their simple meal on a flat stone he had prepared as a table, and she found herself thinking about how much they had both changed since their first tentative exchanges of gifts. The fear and uncertainty that had marked their early interactions had been replaced by an easy companionship that felt both natural and precious. "Ezra," she said suddenly, "I want to try something." He looked up from slicing bread with a knife he had crafted himself, his dark eyes curious. "What did you have in mind?" Clara stood and walked to the stream where they had left so many gifts for each other over the months. She knelt beside the water and cupped her hands to drink, just as she had on that first day when Ezra's appearance had startled her so completely. But this time, when she looked up, she was smiling. "Do you remember the first time we saw each other here?" she asked. Ezra nodded, his expression growing thoughtful. "You were like something from a dream. I had been alone for so long that I thought I might be losing my mind, imagining a beautiful woman appearing in my wilderness." "You ran away so quickly," Clara said, laughing at the memory. "I thought I had frightened you terribly." "You had," Ezra agreed, but he was smiling now too, "not because you seemed dangerous, but because you seemed too good to be real. I was afraid that if I moved or spoke, you would disappear like morning mist." Clara rose and returned to sit beside Ezra, close enough that their shoulders touched, in comfortable intimacy. "I have a confession to make. I was planning to fish today." Ezra raised an eyebrow. "Fish? Clara, I've never seen you show the slightest interest in fishing." "That's exactly the point," Clara said, producing a handmade fishing lure from her bag with a flourish. "I thought it was time I learned, and I wanted you to teach me. But first, I wanted to try using this." The fishing lure was clearly one of Ezra's creations, but unlike his usual careful craftsmanship, this one was deliberately whimsical. The wooden body had been carved to resemble a tiny man with an enormous mustache and bulging eyes, painted in bright colors that no real fish would ever mistake for food. Feathers and bits of colorful thread had been attached at odd angles, creating something that looked more like a children's toy than serious fishing equipment. Ezra stared at the ridiculous lure and then began to chuckle, a sound Clara had heard only rarely during their time together. "Clara, where on earth did you find that thing?" "You made it," Clara said innocently. "I found it among your other gifts. I assume it's some sort of mountain fishing technique I'm not familiar with." "I made that as a joke," Ezra protested, his chuckles growing into genuine laughter. "It was supposed to be a caricature of the pompous fish commissioner who used to visit the mine. I never intended anyone to actually try fishing with it." But Clara was already attaching the absurd lure to a fishing line she had borrowed from Mrs. Murphy, her movements clumsy and unpracticed. "Well, I think it's perfect. If I'm going to learn to fish, I want to do it with style." What happened next would become a story they would tell for the rest of their lives together. Clara's first cast sent the ridiculous lure sailing not into the stream, but directly backward, where it became hopelessly tangled in her own hair. Her attempts to free herself only made the situation worse, until she stood beside the stream with fishing line wrapped around her head like some sort of bizarre crown, the painted wooden man with the enormous mustache dangling beside her left ear. The sight was so completely absurd that Ezra's careful composure finally cracked entirely. The laughter that poured out of him was rich and uninhibited, the sound of a man who had rediscovered pure joy after years of believing it was lost forever. He laughed until tears ran down his cheeks, until his sides ached, until he had to sit down on the ground to catch his breath. And hearing that wonderful sound, seeing the transformation it brought to Ezra's entire being, Clara began to laugh too. She laughed at her own incompetence, at the ridiculous picture she must present, at the sheer happiness of being able to share this moment with someone who had forgotten how to find humor in life's simple absurdities. When their laughter finally subsided, Ezra gently untangled Clara from the fishing line and drew her into his arms for their first real embrace. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair. "Thank you for teaching me how to laugh again." Clara looked up into Ezra's face, seeing there a contentment and peace she had never thought possible when she first encountered the lonely, silent man by this very stream. "Thank you for letting me," she whispered back. The first snow of winter arrived early that year, dusting the mountains with white, while the aspen leaves still clung to their branches in shades of gold and amber. Clara stood at her classroom window, watching the gentle flakes drift past the glass, when she heard familiar heavy footsteps on the schoolhouse porch. Ezra appeared in the doorway, his massive frame filling the entrance as he carefully removed his hat and brushed snow from his shoulders. The children, who had grown accustomed to his occasional visits over the past month, looked up from their arithmetic with bright smiles and eager greetings. "Mr. Stone," called Tommy, the shy boy, who had become one of Clara's most dedicated students. "Did you bring us something today?" Ezra's visits to the schoolhouse had become treasured events for the children. He possessed a natural gift for storytelling, spinning tales of mountain wildlife and frontier history that held even the most restless students spellbound. More importantly, he had begun sharing his woodworking skills, teaching the older children to carve simple figures and useful objects. "As a matter of fact, I did bring something special," Ezra said, his voice carrying the warm confidence that had developed since his return to community life. "But first, Miss Bennett and I have an announcement to make." Clara felt her heart skip as she understood what was about to happen. They had discussed this moment for weeks, planning how to share their news with the people who had become like family to them both. But now that the time had arrived, she felt nervous and excited in equal measure. Ezra reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small wooden box, its surface polished to a lustrous finish and decorated with carved flowers that Clara recognized as columbines, the wildflowers that had marked the beginning of their friendship. He approached her desk with the same careful attention he brought to all important moments, his dark eyes holding a tenderness that took her breath away. The children sensed something significant was happening and fell silent, their young faces bright with curiosity and anticipation. Clara was aware of the profound stillness in the room, the sense that they were all participating in something that would be remembered and retold for years to come. "Clara Bennett," Ezra said, his voice strong and clear as he knelt beside her desk. "You found me when I was lost in ways I didn't even understand. You taught me that kindness is stronger than grief, that love is braver than fear, and that laughter can heal wounds that time alone could never touch." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes as Ezra opened the wooden box to reveal a ring unlike any she had ever seen. Instead of gold or silver, Ezra had crafted the band from a piece of native copper, polished to a warm reddish glow that seemed to capture and reflect the light. Set into the band was not a traditional gemstone, but a perfectly clear piece of quartz crystal that he must have found high in the mountains, cut and polished with the same patient skill he brought to all his work. "This copper came from the mine where David and I worked," Ezra continued, his voice steady despite the emotion. Clara could see in his eyes. "I've carried it with me for 7 years, thinking it was just a reminder of loss. But you've helped me understand that it can be a symbol of new beginnings instead. The children watched in fascinated silence as Ezra lifted the ring from its wooden nest. Clara, will you marry me? Will you help me build a life that honors the past while embracing the future? Clara's answer came without hesitation, her voice ringing clear and strong in the quiet schoolhouse. Yes, Ezra. Yes, with all my heart. As Ezra slipped the copper ring onto Clara's finger, the children erupted in cheers and applause, their excitement filling the small space with joyous noise. Tommy jumped up from his desk and ran to hug Clara's waist, while Sarah clapped her hands together with delight. Now, Ezra said, rising to his full height and addressing the celebrating children, who would like to help me make something special for Miss Ben. I thought we might work together to carve a set of wedding rings, one for each of you to give her as a blessing for our marriage. The response was immediate and enthusiastic, with every child clamoring to participate in the project. As Ezra began distributing small pieces of wood and simple carving tools, Clara watched with amazement at how naturally he had assumed the role of teacher and mentor. Over the following weeks, the wedding preparations became a community effort that brought together everyone in Cedar Ridge. Miss Murphy took charge of the reception planning, insisting that the celebration be held in her saloon, which offered the largest indoor space in town. Sheriff Davies offered to perform the ceremony, having been ordained as a minister before taking up law enforcement. Morrison agreed to provide music on his fiddle, and even the town's children contributed by creating decorations from pine cones and autumn leaves. But perhaps the most meaningful preparation was the letter Ezra finally found the courage to send to his sister-in-law in Denver. With Clara's encouragement, he had written to Margaret Stone, explaining his long absence and extending an invitation to attend his wedding. The letter also included the wooden horse he had carved for his nephew Samuel, along with a photograph of Clara and a promise that there would always be a place in their home for David's family. The response came faster than either Clara or Ezra had dared hope. Margaret Stone's letter was filled with joy and forgiveness, explaining that she had never blamed Ezra for David's death and had spent years hoping he would find his way back to them. She would arrive in Cedar Ridge 3 days before the wedding, bringing 6-year-old Samuel and a heart full of love for the uncle the boy had never known. On the evening before Margaret's arrival, Clara found Ezra standing outside the church where they would be married the following week. The simple wooden building looked beautiful in the early winter twilight, its windows glowing warmly from the oil lamps that had been lit inside. "Are you nervous about seeing Margaret again?" Clara asked, slipping her hand into Ezra's as they stood together in the snow-covered churchyard. Terrified, Ezra admitted honestly, but also grateful. "You've taught me that the best way to honor those we've lost is to live fully for those who remain. David would want me to be part of Samuel's life, to help raise him with stories about his father and the love that surrounded him." Clara squeezed Ezra's hand, feeling the solid presence of the copper ring that had already become as natural as her own heartbeat. "We'll face it together," she said simply. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." As they walked back toward town, their footsteps crunching softly in the fresh snow, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she had been a lonely schoolteacher, seeking purpose in an unfamiliar place. Ezra had been a broken man, hiding from a world that seemed to hold only pain. Now they stood on the threshold of a new life together, surrounded by community, blessed by love, and ready to create a future that honored both their individual past and their shared dream. The morning of Clara and Ezra's wedding dawned clear and cold, with sunshine painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. The entire town of Cedar Ridge had transformed itself for the occasion, with evergreen garlands decorating the church and colored ribbons fluttering from fence posts and doorways despite the winter chill. Clara stood before the mirror in Missy's best guest room, wearing her mother's wedding dress that had been carefully preserved and altered to fit her smaller frame. The ivory silk had yellowed slightly with age, but it carried the weight of family history and the blessing of a marriage that had lasted 37 years before her parents' deaths. Margaret Stone sat nearby, adding the final touches to a crown of winter flowers she had woven for Clara's hair. David's widow had arrived in Cedar Ridge 3 days earlier, with 6-year-old Samuel, and the reunion with Ezra had been everything Clara had hoped for and more. Margaret possessed the same gentle strength that had characterized her late husband, and she had embraced Ezra with tears of joy and forgiveness that healed wounds both siblings-in-law had carried for too long. "There," Margaret said, securing the flower crown with careful pin. "You look absolutely radiant, Clara. Ezra's the luckiest man in Colorado." Young Samuel, who had been playing quietly in the corner with the wooden animals Ezra had carved for him, looked up with bright eyes that reminded Clara powerfully of his father. "Aunt Clara, will you really be my aunt after today?" Clara knelt down to Samuel's level, her heart full at hearing the title she had hoped he might use. "I will indeed, Samuel, and I hope you'll visit us often in our new home." The new home was Ezra's mountain cabin, which they had spent weeks expanding and improving. Ezra had built an additional room that would serve as Clara's study, complete with bookshelves and a desk where she could prepare lessons and correspond with other teachers. He had also constructed a proper guest room for visiting family and friends, making it clear that their mountain sanctuary would welcome the community that had embraced them both. A knock at the door interrupted Clara's thoughts, and Mrs. Murphy entered with the satisfied expression of someone who had orchestrated a complex celebration down to its smallest detail. "It's time, dear," she announced. "The church is full, the minister is ready, and your groom is pacing like a caged bear. I do believe the man is nervous." Clara felt her own butterflies intensify as the moment approached. She had imagined this day countless times over the past weeks, but now that it was here, the reality felt almost too wonderful to believe. The walk to the church took only a few minutes, but it felt like a parade as townspeople emerged from their homes and businesses to offer congratulations and shower Clara with flower petals saved from the autumn harvest. Children ran alongside her small procession, laughing and calling out blessings, while their parents smiled and waved from doorways and windows. Sheriff Davies waited at the church entrance in his best suit, his usually stern face softened by genuine happiness for the couple whose love story had captured the entire community's imagination. As Cedar Ridge's only ordained minister, he had the honor of performing the ceremony, a responsibility he took seriously despite his lack of formal theological training. The church was indeed packed, with every pew filled and additional people standing along the walls. Clara was amazed to see faces she recognized from throughout the county, people who had traveled hours through winter weather to witness this unlikely union between the gentle schoolteacher and the mountain man who had returned from exile. Clara's attention focused entirely on Ezra as she walked down the short aisle toward the simple altar. He stood waiting for her with an expression of such profound love and gratitude that it took her breath away. His hair had been carefully trimmed for the occasion, and he wore a new suit that Margaret had insisted on purchasing as her wedding gift to them both. But it was his eyes that held Clara spellbound, dark and warm, and filled with the promise of a future neither of them had dared imagine a year before. When Clara reached Ezra's side, he took her hands in his and spoke the words they had written together, words that reflected their unique journey from isolation to love. "Clara," Ezra said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church, "you found me in the wilderness and taught me to hope again. You showed me that love is not about protecting ourselves from pain, but about risking everything for another person's happiness. Today I promise to spend the rest of my life proving worthy of the trust you've placed in me." Clara's response came from her heart, words that carried 7 years of healing and the promise of countless years to come. "Ezra, you saved my life in more ways than you know. You taught me that true strength comes from gentleness, that real courage means choosing vulnerability over safety. I promise to love you through whatever storms may come, and to never stop believing in the goodness I first saw in your eyes." As Sheriff Davies pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in cheers and applause that could probably be heard all the way to the mountain peaks. Ezra kissed Clara with tender reverence, sealing promises that had been months in the making. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when little Samuel tugged on Ezra's jacket and held up his arms to be lifted. As Ezra swept his nephew into a three-way embrace that included Clara, the church bell began to ring, calling the community to celebrate a love that had transformed not just two hearts, but an entire town's understanding of redemption and second chances. Years later, as Clara stood on the porch of their mountain home, watching Ezra teach their own children and Samuel's children to carve wood and read the forest's secrets, she would remember this day as the moment when two broken people became whole, when silence learned to sing, and when a lonely mountain man discovered that the greatest wilderness to explore was the human heart willing to love without reservation.